Hello, my name is Ray Dogum, and welcome to VibeCast. Thank you for joining us as we explore the exciting advancements in technology-enabled collaboration to excel important drug development. VibeBio seeks to find every cure for every community. We think big as no one should be left behind in the pursuit of living a healthy, happy, and productive life, free from disease. Collectively, we have the skills, we have the technology, and we have the passion. We now need the community catalyst to bring it all together. That's Vibe. We see a future where communities of biopharma experts and patients collaborate to identify high-potential rare disease medicines and have the ability to access capital on demand to actually develop them. The VibeCast is our informational weekly podcast as we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development with some of the dynamic people that make up the Vibe community. Join us to learn, imagine, question, and help us identify and develop solutions together. Our guest today is Gunnar Esiason. Gunnar is a well-known advocate for individuals with cystic fibrosis and a patient himself. Gunnar has been the face of fundraising efforts for the Boomer Esiason Foundation, which has yielded more than $160 million for the fight against cystic fibrosis since he was diagnosed with the condition in 1993. He's currently on the thought leadership team at Florence Healthcare, where he leads patient-facing strategies with sponsors and contract research organizations. Gunnar, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me today. Did I miss anything? Can you feel free to go ahead and sort of introduce yourself as well, and then we can get into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Awesome to be here. I think you hit most of it. My new favorite title is Dad. I have a 15-month-old son, so that's my new favorite title. But I think we're here to talk about patient advocacy and patient involvement in drug development. So that's my jam, and that's what I'm excited to chat with you about.
Awesome. Maybe we can get started about just telling us about your experience growing up with cystic fibrosis and what are some of the challenges you faced.
Yeah, so for those listeners who may not know what cystic fibrosis is, it's a rare genetic condition that leads to excess mucus buildup in a number of different organs. But most notably and most classically, it's associated with respiratory disease. So if you can, on a very basic level, if you can think about what CF sort of does to somebody, is that thick, sticky mucus clogs the airways, making it more difficult to breathe. And over time, unfortunately, that thick, sticky mucus is a perfect environment for bacterial infections to thrive. So it's a multi-organ disorder. It's sort of affects everything in the body. But growing up with CF, it really didn't impact me super negatively when I was a kid. And that's sort of the case for most people with CF, right? Like, we have a number of, or we have historically had a number of treatments to help manage the symptoms of the disease, from inhaled steroids to mucolytics to inhaled antibiotics, of course. So growing up, it really kind of wasn't, that burdensome for me outside of the general care, outside of the typical trips to the CF Care Center quarterly. And really, for me, it kind of took off when I was unfortunately in high school or just about to get off to college when my disease sort of started to progress. And I think we'll kind of get into that in a minute. But
is that a typical experience you would say?
It is. And, I guess I can give you a little bit of an anecdote to sort of how it happened for me. But, growing up, I wanted to be a football player. Like, my dad played the NFL, started the foundation in 1993 when he was at the peak of his NFL career with the New York Jets. And I wanted to be like my dad, right? I wanted to be like the guy on my high school football team. I had seen the movie Friday Night Lights, and I was like, wow, that could be me. But of course, I was from Long Island and not Texas, where, not exactly the same kind of football culture. But after my junior year of high school, I developed mononucleosis, which sort of flared every single symptom of my cystic fibrosis. And in fact, that summer leading into my senior year, when I had sort of thought that I was going to be the starting quarterback that following season, I basically wasn't able to do anything. Like, I was just constantly treating my CF, over and over and over again with different medications to sort of quell that flaring symptoms that I had. It led to muscle wasting. It led to an inability to put weight on. It sort of just led to a series of issues that we just could not get in front of. And then finally, when training camp rolled around at the end of August, it was clear to everyone, probably except me, that I was not fit to play football that season. But I was, 17 years old at the time. I was was stubborn. I was like self-motivated by like my own challenges in life. I was kind of, you were 17 at one point, you could take over the world when you're that age.
Oh yeah. We could do
anything. So I stubbornly, suited up for that first day of training camp, and I put myself through hell for a couple of weeks. And then, a few weeks into camp, I, during a conditioning session, we're doing sprints back and forth across the field. I actually collapsed in the field. And it was sort of like everyone's like worst nightmare coming to fruition. All of my teammates knew that I had CF. The coaching staff knew that I had CF. And it was just like a terrible situation because everyone saw like Gunnar was down. I kind of came to, and I looked up and I saw all of my teammates, looking back down at me like they had all just seen a ghost. And I couldn't really quite figure out what was going on until I kind of pulled myself up. I looked down and I saw that I had blood all over my jersey. I had just had a massive hemoptysis on the football field. I just remember the trainer coming over and being like, are you okay? Can you breathe? Like, do you want us to call 911? Do you want to go to the hospital? Like, what do you want to do? I just remember being like, just call my mom. Just call my mom. My mom will know what to do. And sure enough, my mom came to school, picked me up, and next thing you know, we were in the car to the CF Center at Columbia University. Before I knew it, my football career was over. Right? We realized that my CF had basically just started to take over my childhood, or what was left of my childhood before I went off to college. And then, to make a long story short, it dawned upon me that I had to mature quickly and sort of be willing to let go of one dream so that I could pursue the rest of my life, go off to college, and at least give myself a chance to move forward. So, for me, that was the sort of the pivotal moment that I look back at and realize when my health changed. And I think a lot of people with CF, if you ask them, they could all point to a single moment or a series of moments that sort of changed their life trajectory with CF.
Gunnar, thanks for sharing that story. And I can only imagine how powerful of an experience that was for you and for your family and your friends too, and your whole team, really. And I just want to thank you for persevering through it all. I feel like there's been probably a lot more stories that you can share with us that have similar sort of impact as well. And, really, it's really powerful that you've been able to accomplish and create so much value. And just like so far, right, you still have so much time to kind of continue to participate and continue to like contribute to this community. And speaking of the, cystic fibrosis community, and also about your father, because I know, the question is what was it like growing up with your father, who was a professional athlete, who was always in the spotlight, and then having him shine that light back on you to help you advocate for the CF community? Yeah.
I think my dad, still is a fairly typical dad. Like, I mean, he does the dad stuff, right? Like, when I got married, I guess almost 2 years ago now, he was like sitting in the front row, like with his iPhone out taking photos. Meanwhile, we have a photographer at the wedding. Like, he does like the classic dad stuff. And occasionally you'll see him actually like, taking photos with an iPad, which is just insane. But
you need that Insta.
Yeah, exactly. All that's to say that, I feel like he and my mom really did everything they could to give me a fairly typical childhood. Given my life with CF, but also his stature as a pro athlete, and then later a media personality. The story of actually how my parents got involved in CF is one that's is really quite unique. My dad won the NFL MVP in 1989 after the Cincinnati Bengals had a great year and went to the Super Bowl. They unfortunately lost the Super Bowl. But that summer after the season, he was sort of like America's guest, I guess, right? As the NFL MVP does the rounds at like do charity galas or black tie dinners, or, things like that. And at one in particular, there was a sports writer by the name of Frank DeFord who was giving a presentation or giving a talk about his daughter Alex, who passed away from cystic fibrosis in the 1970s, when there was basically no treatments back then for kids with CF. And it was a heartfelt story about everything that the DeFord family had done since Alex unfortunately passed away, and how they kept her memory alive. And my dad was so touched by the talk that he and my mom went up to Frank after the dinner and said, how can we get involved in cystic fibrosis fundraising. This is like, this is a terrible, terrible thing. And we just feel so moved by your story. So that summer they, went back to Cincinnati, and my dad was still playing with the Bengals at the time, and actually did a lot of fundraising for cystic fibrosis, research for cystic fibrosis families. They visited CF patients in the hospital, and this was well before I was even born. So my dad was actually involved in CF, sort of like the CF community, well before I even, joined the planet. And of course, I was born 2 years later, then diagnosed 2 years after that. And sort of a little bit of I'm sure a blessing and a curse for my parents when they got the CF diagnosis, because they knew the horrors of CF, right? They had been doing stuff with the community for a few years, so they saw the worst parts of it. But they also recognized that they knew community members. And my dad always says that his first call after I was diagnosed was to his dad, but his second call was to Frank DeFord. And Frank DeFord told my dad, this is what we've needed. We've needed a celebrity to put a face on this disease to help change the trajectory for these kids. And my dad took that and ran with it. He used his stature in the sports world to put a face on the disease. And, he and my mom are very aware that they did not give me a choice in the matter, right? I was 2 years old. And the next thing you know, we ended up on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And they still talk about it, right? They still talk about the decision to be very public with the disease. And they felt like it was a responsibility for them to do so.
I guess might be a kind of interesting question. How do you feel about that decision? Do you feel like it was the right move? Are you proud of this? Or did you feel like initially maybe you might have struggled being, so publicly available to the community?
I think it was a great decision that my parents made. My childhood was very much like dotted with, CF fundraising events or things like that. So it didn't really strike me as like odd. Only once I was a little older, in the dawn of social media sort of came on the scene, did I recognize that I had been so visible, for better or worse. I also think that my dad was super smart about the platform that he had, and the motivation to do so. I mean, like, he's like the ultimate competitive person, right? I mean, that's what it takes to be a pro football player. So he was the right person at the right time. And I don't think any of us in our family feel like they made, my parents made a bad decision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm sure the entire community thinks it was the right decision as well, because so much research has happened and so much value has been drawn from that. And, it's not that often someone like you can come up and help a rare disease community kind of thrive like this. And I think that there are many rare diseases or people with rare diseases that are struggling to find funding. They don't have a celebrity. What advice would you be able to give them, or what kind of
Yeah, I think, I want to be clear, we've played a small part in this, right? Like the real, great thing about the CF community is that, we rally around our institutions that are really driving scientific progress forward. And the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation really deserves a ton of credit for being innovative in the way that they've developed the care model, innovative in the way they've developed the clinical trial model, innovative in the way they've developed their biotech financing model. Like, all of these things are major powers that have come together to show where we are today. And that would not be possible if the community did not rally around those efforts in ways that are just enormous.
Let's talk a little bit more about like the clinical trials and like the patient connection to sponsors, and how Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has also been a huge player. I don't know. Do you want to talk about your position at Florence Healthcare and relate that to? Yeah, let's hear about that.
Yeah, so I'll say my position at Florence Healthcare is really not related to CF in a lot of ways, but it is the after effect of my time as a clinical trial participant. So really, over the last 10 years, I've spent more time as a clinical trial participant than I have not enrolled in a trial. And the reason is because when I was about 22 or 23 years old, I was basically on the verge of end-stage disease right when I graduated college. I mean, if I was in the middle of a pulmonary exacerbation, getting from the bedroom to the bathroom in the morning was virtually impossible. And I, recognized quite young that, 22, that, our health systems had a terminal limit for what they could provide to me, a patient, right? So, that in layman's terms, that's really the we are running out of options conversation. And, I first had that chat with my doctor when I was, again, 22 or 23. And, I remember her saying, we are frankly running out of antibiotic options, and we need to start getting comfortable with life being so disrupted by CF. And that disruption showed itself in different capacities. One is I was, basically either in and out of the hospital or in and out of interventional radiology to get a PICC line placed almost every 2 or 3 weeks. I would go 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And, living like that was not a way to live, right? I couldn't start a career. I couldn't like develop a social life. I frankly moved back in with my parents. I wasn't able to live independently. And this was all when I was, should have been like in the highlight of my life. And then I was finally offered an opportunity to join a clinical trial. And I joined the trial for a few reasons, but one driving factor for me was that I was frankly out of options and I needed to, resort to, experimental medicine. And while that trial didn't work for me, it was fortunate in the sense that because I was in a trial program, I was encountering the medical system over and over and over again, that my decline was abated just because there were so many touch points. So that was one benefit of being in the trial, but unfortunately, the medicine didn't work for me. While I was in that trial, though, a few things dawned upon me. First is that whoever designed the trial probably didn't ask a sick person what it was like, what they would, feel about being in a trial that was designed in such a way. I just remember being forced to use different technology solutions that they never worked. I remember being forced.
What do you mean by technology solutions?
So there was in some ways the trial was ahead of its time because there was a remote patient monitoring, component to it. They gave us a pulmonary function device to bring home and measure our pulmonary function from our house. And it connected to this old telephone. It looked like a generation one iPhone is kind of what it looked like. Right. It wasn't, but that's what it looked like. And the technology, it just never worked. It just always broke down. It never accepted efforts. And there I was, trying to do my pulmonary function efforts while being super sick, not knowing if I had the drug or the placebo. And it started triggering thoughts in my mind, what the heck am I doing here? I feel worse after doing this. This trial is not helping. And that was pretty enlightening to me, right? I saw that this was a bad design. Unfortunately, the protocol kind of changed a little bit, and that part just kind of went away. But it was informative for me, right? It recognized that there probably is a place for patients to participate in designing what the trials look like so that they can actually run efficiently. Long story short, after a number of different trial programs that I was in, I finally joined the clinical trial in 2018 for a drug that came to be known as Trikafta. I dosed the drug, and within 12 hours, I knew that I didn't have the placebo. It worked so remarkably fast. 36 hours later, my cough went away, and then a week after that, my pulmonary function just exploded. And I felt like a few things happened. One is I was like, holy crap, I can breathe. This is amazing. Biochemistry has come to the rescue. But two, I was left asking, if this drug is working so remarkably well, so fast, why does the trial need to continue going forward? This thing is a miracle, and yet it had to go through the entire process, rightfully so, through the regulatory process and approval stages and everything like that. But the pace at which it ended up being approved, and while it was one of the fastest drugs ever approved, it was still too slow for some people with CF, right? Those last few people with CF who passed away, at the end of 2019 and early 2020, because Trikafta just showed up too late for them. Begs the necessary question, what can be done to make things faster? And that's really how I found my way to Florence Healthcare, which provides tech solutions to, speed up trials even a little bit.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I did read a little bit about Trikafta. It sounds like an amazing drug. And I think Vertex Pharma is the manufacturer of that. And, I also read that it treats many of the common cystic fibrosis mutations or conditions, but it doesn't specifically address some of the rare mutations for other patients. Do you know a little bit about that? Can you explain that a little bit? And just to give people context around how drugs work, right?
Yeah. So Trikafta is among a class of CFTR modulators. It's actually the fourth CFTR modulator produced by Vertex. And each generation of med has been able to work for an increasingly larger size of the population. Trikafta is suitable for 90% of the CF population. And it works just by, basically, correcting the protein dysfunction at the heart of CF. It doesn't do anything on a genetic level. It's a protein corrector. Unfortunately, there's about 10% of the CF population that has a rare combination of mutations, right? In order to have CF, you need to have 2 recessive CFTR mutations that lead to the disease. And there's, 1,400 different potential mutations. Any 2 of them lead to CF. Unfortunately, there's different rare combinations that most times lead to the body not producing any CFTR. So the CFTR my body produces, again, it's a protein, is dysfunctional. It doesn't fold correctly, it doesn't work properly, and Trikafta allows it to function. For the people who unfortunately don't produce CFTR, they still have the same manifestations of CF as a disease, the thick, sticky mucus and the organ decline. But Trikafta has nothing to correct because there's no protein inside their bodies to be corrected. So unfortunately for those folks, right now there's no disease-altering medication for them. And they're left with the classical symptoms of cystic fibrosis. So in order to sort of alter their courses of disease, they're going to require genetic medicines, either gene therapies, gene editing, or mRNA therapies to actually create the CFTR protein that is either functional or CFTR protein that can then be corrected by our CFTR modulators.
Thanks for sharing that. I read an article in the New York Times, what's it like to learn you're going to live longer than you expected? And it was about CF, and it was about, cystic fibrosis patients, having a renewed prescription to life now because of this drug, Trikafta. And you kind of mentioned, you alluded to, that's how you felt as well. And a lot of other people, more than 90% of the population, feels this way. Just tell me how that feels,
Yeah, it was a really insightful article in the New York Times opinion section that was published, several weeks back, and it sort of talked about this, issue that is, I guess, in some ways unanticipated for people with CF. That suddenly our identities as someone who's otherwise very sick is just evaporated almost overnight, and that's something that I very acutely felt. Not long after I started the trial, my wife and I went on a road trip, right? Because my now wife, then girlfriend at the time, went on a road trip. I dragged her to the battlefield of Gettysburg, the battlefield of Antietam, and then we went to Washington, D.C. And I'm a little bit of a history buff, super nerd. And we, of course, had the behind the scenes negotiations to pick this as the trip. And one of the concessions that I gave away was that we would do the tour of Gettysburg on a Segway. I hated the Segway. My wife loved the Segway. So that was kind of a funny thing. That's awesome. On the way, so we lived in New York at the time, and on our way home from Washington, D.C., we're stuck in traffic on the New Jersey Turnpike, and anyone who's ever from the tri-state knows what that's like.
Oh yeah.
And it added 2.5 hours to our 4-hour drive. So
you had a lot of time on your hands.
Yeah, we had some time. We had time to talk, and she looked at me and she said, Gunnar, you have the rest of your life ahead of you. What do you want to do with it? And this was, I started the trial in, I guess it was April, and this was August, the end of August. So several months later, and it was the first time I had ever thought about that in my life. I was, I guess I was 27 at the time. And I had never considered that I would have the rest of my life to live. And there she was peppering me with this question, and I had to think about it. Right. I realized that I was no longer sick, in the classical sense of the word. I still did treatments to treat, the infections in my lungs, but, cystic fibrosis was no longer creating the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off pulmonary, exacerbation nightmare that I had been spiraling inside for the last 5 years of my life. And, she, as she kind of continued to press me on that question, it occurred to me that my life as a patient advocate had sort of manifested in such a way that I realized that I had no technical hands-on training in all of the topics that we were talking about, right? All the topics that patient advocates talk about, right? a lot of us, we just stand up on the soapbox and we just scream at the healthcare industry for making things, too inefficient. And we feel like it's our role to hold people accountable and get things done more effectively, right? Like, I mean, there's no greater example of that than the AIDS community in the early 90s. I realized that I had to actually think about a career. I had to think about providing for a family. I had to think about my future. I had to think about retirement. And I decided that, the best thing for me was to go to grad school, take like a ginormous risk, come out of my comfort zone and head off to business school. That's what I did. I went to Dartmouth. I got an MBA and a master's of public health there. And I realized that my intangible experiences as a patient advocate could be married with real technical experience inside the healthcare industry to make healthcare more patient friendly. And I've since developed this hypothesis that if you put the right career patients or patients with the proper skills inside early stage healthcare companies, you can create a culture inside those companies that is patient thinking, patient forward, and is keeping the patient not only as a customer at the center of the business, but also one that enables efficiencies for those customers to actually access products.
And with Florence Healthcare, right, the software platform, it currently is linked to more than 10,000 research sites and to hundreds of sponsors. So I'm putting that hypothesis to the test, right? So Florence Healthcare offers different software solutions that are mostly for like the administrative or infrastructure side of clinical trials, but we do have patient-facing tech, and that's an e-consent tool, right? So, having been in a number of clinical trials, I've recognized that consenting is like one of the worst parts of the trial, right? Which is funny because it's probably the most important part of the trial too. It's when, the benefits and risks and concerns are sort of discussed with the patients and prompts questions. Right. But for anyone who's been in a clinical trial and might be listening to this, they know that the consent process really kind of feels like a lecture about one's own disease. So I always find it funny that whenever I consent for a CF clinical trial, part of that consent process is a research coordinator telling me about what it's like to live with cystic fibrosis. So that's like a weird irony that's embedded in this process. It's just you should flip the chairs, right? They should have the patient
in some capacities,
and that coordinator could be a bit more educated from that perspective, at least.
It's funny. I think the research coordinators. I have a strong opinion about them. I think those people are actually the people that like prop up, the multi-billion-dollar industry of the biotech world. So they have an essential role in this, but they've got a hard job, and their job calls on them to do this to patients, which is a weird thing.
It's true. It's very restrictive what they could do. Like they have to follow the protocol. Otherwise, if they deviate from that, it could be considered a problem for the trial.
Right, exactly. Trial. And it's a hard job to do, and great deal of respect for research coordinators who willingly take that on. But yeah, I think it's, for me, this is one very, very extremely narrow problem. Of which there are a million different problems that I like to focus on. But I figured this would be a great place to put my hypothesis to test. And Florence Healthcare has enabled me and also our department within our company to be forward looking and to actually put that to the test and see what happens when you put career patients inside product development.
So are you working more with clinical sites or more with the sponsors and pharmaceutical companies?
A little bit of everything. My job's a little unique in the sense that while Florence is a healthy, growing company, I feel like I have a very startup-y role in the sense that I kind of bounce around across the company from marketing functions to product development functions to sort of sales functions, BD functions, like a kind of jack of all trades. In some capacity, but
awesome. That's really cool.
We kind of work with everyone.
Sounds like a dream job.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun.
So one thing you mentioned earlier about CF, your Trikafta treatments, I was just curious because we didn't cover it. What are the treatments like as a patient? Like, what do you have to do?
Yeah. So growing up, my typical treatment routine is once in the morning and once in the evening, and it included. Nebulized medications. Sorry. So yeah, one session in the morning and then one session in the evening of a series of nebulized medications. So I start with like an albuterol or like an inhaled steroid mucolytic, then clear the mucus. Another treatment that typically thins that cystic fibrosis, thick, sticky mucus, and then an inhaled antibiotic to treat an infection if there is in fact one. And sort of the irony of this, the story of cystic fibrosis drug development through the 90s and then early 2000s is that a number of different CF treatments were either sort of identified or brought to market. And what it actually happened is that treatment session in both the morning and then that treatment session in the evening actually grew longer and longer and longer as there were more and more medications that sort of came to market to treat the symptoms of CF, right? We weren't altering the underlying cause of CF. We were just trying to slow the progress by, treating those symptoms that would otherwise lead to respiratory failure. And, by the time that I was, sort of at the end of college and I was extremely sick, I remember spending an hour and a half at least on my treatments in the morning and then an hour and a half at least on my treatments in the evening. And then if I got sick and developed a pulmonary exacerbation, we would throw IV antibiotics on top of it, right? Because that infectious bacteria leads to the classic symptoms of infection that, anyone might have if they develop an infectious disease, although it's just, far more serious for someone with CF. So sort of at the peak of my illness, about, 8 or 9 years ago, it would be not unusual for a day to look like an hour and a half of treatments in the morning, IV, antibiotics really kind of throughout the day, another treatment session in the evening. And then overnight, I also have a feeding tube. So I would plug myself into overnight tube feeds to supplement the amount of nutrition that I was able to take in when I was super sick. So it sort of felt like a full-time job. Where we are now is like not anything remotely close to what that even looked like. I no longer do my overnight feeding tube. I haven't needed IV antibiotics in several years, knock on wood. Oh. Still have that infection in my lungs. So I still treat my lungs with some inhaled medications. But in the morning, it takes me about 20 minutes. And then in the evening, another 20 minutes. So Trikafta is a pill that I take twice a day. And it really has basically altered every single thing about my day and my life.
That's amazing. And I think that a lot of patients out there, hopefully also receiving the same treatments, are getting that like second wind of life. And I think that's really awesome.
It is.
And
I'll tell you,
technology and biotech has been able to get to this point because, for years and years, this was not an option, right?
It is. And I'll give you a stat that's pointing to patients getting a second wind of life. And it's something my family has also experienced. But the number of pregnancies and patients who are undertaking family building in the cystic fibrosis community has dramatically increased. I mean, like it's exploded over the last couple of years. Some patients we're kind of hilariously calling it the Trikafta baby boom, where women are getting pregnant much more easily. Men with CF are now thinking about family building, and unfortunately, CF comes with a pinch of infertility across the population, but especially in men. Unfortunately, we're born with a congenital absence of the vas deferens, which means that sperm can't exit our bodies, and we need to use assisted reproductive technologies to father children. But it's happening at a crazy rate, right? Where my wife and I, we now have a son who's 15 months old, and I feel like every day I hear of a new person with CF that's announcing a pregnancy or trying to get pregnant. So that alone is the marker of progress.
I also saw the Boomer Esiason Foundation is offering a grant for IVF for some of these patients as well. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. We're super, super excited about that. We just announced, the foundation just announced that we are offering IVF financial assistance grants. Unfortunately, in the U.S., there's inefficiencies everywhere, and one of them is that in a lot of places, assisted reproductive technology is completely out of pocket. Right, insurance doesn't often cover it. In some cases, it will, but for a lot of people, it's an out-of-pocket cost all the way through. And my wife and I learned that firsthand that it can be pretty expensive. And while my wife and I are fortunate enough that we were able to cover those costs, we've recognized that it's a barrier for a lot of CF families to think about family building. So. Our foundation, again, we feel a responsibility to offer assistance and aid to CF families where and whenever we can. And we've recognized that there is suddenly a demand for family building services. So it's a place where our foundation has decided to step up and offer grants to help with the cost of IVF.
And I know like newborn screening for CF has also become a really, great thing, or really easy to do nowadays, right?
Yeah. So, newborn, because cystic fibrosis is a genetic condition, newborn screening is one of those things that is really an essential practice. And unfortunately, I was diagnosed late. I was diagnosed when I was 2 years old. And after I got the CF diagnosis, my parent, one of the first advocacy issues that my parents worked on, I was of course too young, is to make sure that newborn screening was available in all 50 states. And it is, and there's still some gaps, right? Like there's gaps on the number of, mutations that are, either identified or looked for during newborn screening. But largely it's highly effective. Newborn screening in some capacity is available in all 50 states now. And it's, it pays to find a CF diagnosis as early as possible, especially with these highly effective modulator treatments being on the market. You want to get you want to start those things as fast as possible so you can abate the progression of the disease.
So in addition to the Trikafta drug from Vertex, are there other drugs in development in the pipeline in the industry? And what are they aiming to do? Yes,
it's a good question. So the cystic fibrosis drug pipeline is extraordinarily robust. And I'll talk for a moment why that is. So the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is sort of at the center of our disease, of our community, actually doesn't operate totally like a traditional nonprofit. They make for-profit investments into biotech companies. So they will take equity, or they will take royalty rights, or some combination of a stake, of a for-profit stake inside of a biotech company, like a life science venture capital firm would, in fact. And the CF Foundation is in the unique position of having the world-leading scientific experts of CF embedded inside the organization or part of the clinical care network. So that does a few things. One, it gives any invested company, any company that has an investment in it from the foundation, access to the clinical trial network, right? Finding patients for clinical trials is extraordinarily difficult, and the CF Foundation in part solves that by sort of having everything under the same hood. The other thing those venture investments do is it signals to other venture investors or Wall Street broadly that this is a good idea. This company has passed our diligence. It is worth considering. It is worth putting mountains of capital into. Wall Street hears that, and it's sort of off to the races. There are some downsides to venture philanthropy. There's like some questions of conflict of interest that are sort of inherent when a company, when an organization that controls the clinical trial network is picking companies, right? So you could figure out a scenario where maybe a company that doesn't engage with the venture philanthropy fund has a harder time getting clinical trial patients, right? Because they're not sort of on the inside. So there's some weird issues about it, but overall, it's an enormous net positive. And in fact, it's actually the reason I went to business school. Like I was just so inspired by the forward thinking of the foundation that developed this model that I was like, wow, this is awesome. That is a great way to conquer a disease. Like I want to learn as much about it as I can. So as a result of that, the CF Foundation, put a ton of money into a small biotech company called Aurora Biosciences, which was later acquired by Trikafta. And as the CFTR modulator treatments from Vertex got approved, of course, culminating with Trikafta, the foundation sold royalty rights after royalty rights, and has since grown its bank account substantially, in the order of billions of dollars that it has now put back into investments and basic biomedical research for cystic fibrosis, right? It's a case study for, really serious nonprofit organizations to follow, and others do, right? The Juvenile Diabetes Research Fund is an organization that has a venture fund. The National MS Society has one. So they're starting to pop up in other places, and everyone is looking for their home run, like the CF Foundation has had. But the result of that is now there's dozens of, 24 or so, gene therapy technologies that are in the preclinical stage about to enter the clinic that are especially geared towards solving the CFTR dysfunction issue for that last 10% of patients that can't take Trikafta. The foundation has also poured tons of money into anti-infectives, and in some really unique ways has actually normalized what otherwise would seem like alternative technologies. I'm not talking about like herbal medicines or anything, but like they've invested in bacteriophage therapies. They've invested in one product that's a gallium-based anti-infective. So they're normalizing a lot of different technologies for putting shots on goal for patients. So the pipeline is full of products and opportunities, and really what that means is it puts a big burden on the patients now that need to staff those clinical trials for all of these companies that will be hungry for participants.
Well, hopefully the network and the community is large enough where getting those patients to participate in those trials won't be so difficult, right?
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where the CF community has rallied around clinical trials for years, and I don't expect it'll stop anytime soon.
What are some misconceptions about cystic fibrosis that you'd like to address?
Some misconceptions. I think one learning that I've had, you're coming from the patient advocacy world, is that especially like the rare disease patient advocacy world, is that patients are geared towards like one thing and one thing only, and it's research for the cure, right? Like your time and effort is valuable because it needs to contribute to community functions, to research for a cure. What nobody prepares patients and patient advocates for is the battle that then comes after medications sort of make their way through the pipeline. And it's especially acute in rare disease populations where rightfully these medicines command large price tags because they have small customer bases. I find that there are forces out there, whether bureaucratic forces or academic forces, that just leech onto these rare disease medications and try to do whatever they can to like point to them as a bad example of the biotech industry, coming to the rescue. When in fact, I'm like, wait a second, this is exactly what we all want, right? In the capital society in which we live, we want a drug maker to come and set a market for our rare disease so that other companies will come in and want to take a piece of it, or want to come in and improve on the standard of care to then command the market for themselves, right? So
you want that competition so we can get the best.
Right, exactly. Research. And I think because it's the pharmaceutical industry and it's just not beloved universally by the masses for whatever reason, there's a lot of scrutiny that's put onto rare disease drug companies, rare disease product launches, rare disease regulators that are that push things through quickly. So it's that I think is like the greatest problem and misconception about CF and rare disease broadly, is that our markets for our diseases are what provide hope and keep us alive. It's what we need to move forward into the future.
Yeah, and are you saying that like although the prices of the drugs are super high, it's still the market price, and that's not necessarily like a
it's
right. It might be a problem, but it's not necessarily something that's easily solvable either.
It's the way I think about it is, and I'm part of the nonprofit called No Patient Left Behind, which talks about these issues, is the biotech industry enters into a social contract with both society and our payers, right? And it's that medications are launched at the market price for what they're valued for, and then need to transition to generic as a commodity for society for the rest of time. Trikafta is a great example of that, right? It's a small molecule medication, so it's the kind of drug that you would expect to go branded for finite period of time, 12 or 13 years, and then generic for the rest of time, right? Vertex has every right to make a profit on Trikafta for what the value it is providing to society, right? I mean, look at me, right? I was sick. I was heading like to the worst parts of health, and then suddenly turned around. I like put myself through grad school, got married, and now I have a son with my wife, and I've also put myself into a career, right? Like that is the value of medicine, and that's happening across the CF population. But the best part of Trikafta is that because it's a small molecule medicine, it'll go generic. It can't be, it's difficult to patent protect those drugs like some other biologic medicines have been in the past. And when it does go generic in 13 years, right, the cost of taking care of someone with CF will basically just collapse almost overnight. So when you consider the value of a medicine from the time it starts in the test tube to 100 years down the future, right, the number of people that it touches is enormous. And we find that the the self-proclaimed arbiters of drug effectiveness across the world don't want to look at things that way because they're pursuing an agenda of hawkishness on drug pricing, which is just idiotic. If you want to be hawkish, on healthcare costs, like go look at the hospitals.
Like that's a lot of wasted.
They do not go costs. Generic. Right.
Question on: do you know the market price of Trikafta now?
Yeah, so Trikafta it's about a $300,000 drug for 1 year of
treatments
for a year of treatment. And that's where the value of insurance is, right? So we all buy insurance, or we subscribe to our government's, payer system with the knowledge that at any one time we need a medicine, even if it's high priced, the insurance provider will give it to us because we are customers of it, right? So that's when I talk about the social contract between the biotech industry and the insurance industry. Is the insurance industry has the responsibility of covering it even when it's high priced, but it'll benefit in much longer term as those medicines transition to generic.
Right, especially because the costs that they would have had to pay for treating a patient with CF without Trikafta could have been way higher.
Right, and it's a weird thing, right? Because the insurance provider, in my case, right, doesn't really need to consider my economic output to the society, right? It only considers me as a cost for their bottom line. They're not considering my career, they're not considering my job, they're not considering money I'm putting back into the economy. They're just looking at one thing, right?
Right. What are you most concerned about these days?
What am I most concerned about these days?
I know one thing that you mentioned when we previously talked was antibacterial resistance.
Yes. So I appreciate the prompt. That's exactly where I was going to go. The antibiotic market right now is completely dysfunctional. And as a result, very few antimicrobial medicines or anti-infective medicines are entering the drug development pipeline, like from the test tube, and getting all the way through the regulatory phases to launch. That acutely affects people with CF because, as I said earlier in the show, we live with that with an environment in our lungs that allows bacterial infections to flourish. And the way we treat those bacterial infections is by exposing them over and over and over again to antibiotics. But for anyone who's a student of antibiotic resistance or bacterial evolution knows that those bacteria that live in our lungs evolve to become impervious to drugs that we use over time. And it's a little bit of an interesting sort of conundrum. Everyone knows that antibiotic resistance is coming, and yet our currently available antibiotics still work largely for most people who present with an infection, right? So although I would consider my bacterial infections to be highly drug resistant to many drugs, I'm still able to take some antibiotic medications occasionally, less so now that I'm on Trikafta, way less now that I'm on Trikafta, that sort of able to just keep my bacterial infection either in check or sort of like in a state of quiescence where it's not actually doing much of anything. And yet I know that if my antibiotics fail, despite everything Trikafta has given to me, there's a risk that things could spiral out of control quite quickly. And the antibiotic market, for those who don't sort of know the issue that's out there, is an interesting one, right? Because there are so few new antibiotics coming through the pipeline, the real method that we have to control, like the medical community, like the healthcare system, society, has to control antibiotic resistance is to use those drugs less and less and less, right? The idea is that if you expose bacteria to antibiotics, fewer times throughout the course of treatment, the resistance may not grow as stubborn. Of course, like a drug maker doesn't want to hear that, right? Like that means their product is being used less. That means there's less revenue. And, drug companies are really good at responding to incentives, right? They like listen to incentives really just about as good as anyone. And as a result, have basically abandoned antibiotic development for all intents and purposes. And that creates a problem because we know that despite this antibiotic stewardship of using antibiotics as little as possible, the bacteria will win. Like essentially nature is going to win. Yeah. So we need new antibiotics as a society. And that's something that scares me, right? It's a broken market. It's not a perfectly competitive market in any way. It's a market that is so unique that it does not allow for development to flourish like it might otherwise for other indications. And that's a policy fix, right? Like that we need government intervention into into the antibiotic market to fix it, to allow for drug makers to be incentivized once again to go after antibiotics. And the real case in point here is that the antibiotics we're using today are the same antibiotics that were discovered decades and decades and decades ago. So we've had nothing new. And the CF Foundation, as a nonprofit, has played an important role in this. Like, they're investing into this broken market, fully well knowing that the market forces are not working, and yet they are not, for as big as they are not big enough to carry drugs over the finish line.
I really hope it doesn't take a serious sort of health situation or health crisis.
Yeah, that's the hope, huh?
Right. I hope. I mean, we'll see what happens. But thanks for sharing that. Final question, and then we can wrap up. What are your future goals and plans for your advocacy work?
Future goals and plans. I would say that I think the CF Foundation has set a model for what it looks like to conquer a disease, or mostly conquer a disease. The fact that they bring together, private industry into the nonprofit world is really one of the most remarkable things in really the history of medicine. And it can allow for really incredible things, right? So for rare disease patient groups that are looking at, watching this, or maybe looking for their own treatments one day, the CF Foundation is an important, business case study for what can go right. And it's not easy. There's a lot of steps along the way for what they did. They set the unified scientific strategy. They set up the clinical care network. They set up the clinical trial network. They set up the venture fund. And this took thousands and thousands and thousands of patients to live and die with CF to unfortunately get us to where we are, right? I think about the progress that we've made in CF, and it's really only possible because of the people living with CF in the 70s and before, in the 80s and the 90s, who came and went before us and volunteered for clinical trials and did the hard work of getting these initiatives going. So for me, like, recreating that as many times as possible is my goal. That is very clearly my goal.
Thanks for sharing that. Is there anything else that we haven't really talked about that you want to mention here today?
No, Ray, I appreciate the time. This has been awesome.
Awesome. Well, Gunnar, thank you so much for your time. We talked about your life as a patient advocate, as well as your professional industry experience too, with CF. So thanks again so much for your time, and look forward to keep following you and supporting you. And just thank you so much for being part of this community and the Vibe team.
Happy to do it.
Thanks.